Namaste Swadika. My name is Aparna Patwardhan. I'm the director of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center, Embassy of India, Bangkok. A warm welcome to today's event, which is a talk and discussion on the book, A New Idea of India, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. It's written by two young authors, Shiv Madhusudhan Gupta and Rajeev Mantri. The book scans through India's political, social, and economic history since India's independence. India's civilization is the oldest continuous civilization in the world. It has encountered various influences over time which have shaped it, but at the core of this civilization has been dharma or righteousness. India, which is the largest democracy with a population of 1.3 billion people, is unique in many ways, and today its greatest advantage is its demography. India has the largest share of youth population in the world, which is approximately 35%. With the power and energy of youth, India is scripting a new history in every sphere. Atmanirbhar Bharat or Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan or Self-Reliant India campaign is a vision of new India envisaged by the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi. The aim is to make the country and its citizens independent and self-reliant in all senses. To enable this, several government reforms across sectors have been announced. The environment is congenial to the emerging of a new generation of young entrepreneurs in all sectors in India. As India progresses, it is also necessary to keep seeking new ideas to further galvanize the growth and transformation of the country so that India reaches its greatest potential. In this context, the well-researched arguments of the authors regarding individual liberty, fundamental rights, reforms, etc. for India are food for thought. This book has received acclaim from leaders, intellectuals, and thinkers of Indian society. And no less than our Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, tweeted that the book makes rich contributions to intellectual discourse. I'm very happy that in the 75th year of Indian independence, which we are celebrating, the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center is organizing a discussion on a new idea of India. Let's move to the session and begin with an introduction of the two authors. Mr. Gupta Madhusudhan is an India-based public markets investor. He has written extensively on economics, finance, and politics for Mint, Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, the Indian Express, and other publications. Mr. Gupta graduated from Dartmouth College with a degree in economics. Mr. Gupta also holds an MBA from INSEAD. Mr. Rajeev Mantri is an India-based entrepreneur and investor, investing in public companies and early-stage technology ventures. He has contributed articles on political economy, technology investing, and entrepreneurship to Mint, Swarajya, the Wall Street Journal, the Indian Express, and other publications. Mr. Mantri graduated with a BS in Material Science and Engineering from Northwestern University and an MBA from Columbia University, specializing in private equity and value investing. A very warm welcome, Mr. Shiv Gupta and Mr. Rajeev Mantri. We also have a very eminent panel with us. We have two Thai scholars who studied in India and therefore are interested in what path India takes. We have three Indian scholars from Thailand who are members of the diaspora and naturally invested in the idea of India. We also have a scholar from India. Dr. Chaivat Phuakong is a Thai scholar who studied in India. He teaches at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Surat Thani Rajabhat University. He is Vice President of Academic Services of Surat Thani Rajabhat University. Dr. Pianath Soikam is an ICCR scholar who studied in India. He's assistant to the President for Organizational Communications and Public Engagement, Faculty of Political Science, Upon Ratchathani University. Dr. Shweta Sinha is an assistant professor in environmental technology from Thammasat University. She has been involved in various international projects and research activities related to climate change, agriculture, parametric insurance, community resilience, disaster risk management, gender, and sustainable development. Dr. Sulabh Dhanuka currently leads the international B2B business of True Digital Group, which is one of the leading telcos of Thailand and part of the CP Group. He was formerly an associate principal at McKinsey, where he advised clients on strategy, operations, and digital transformations. He holds a PhD in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan. Dr. Shibu Dharmarajan is a faculty member, graduate programs in counseling psychology at Assumption International University, Bangkok. And we have a panelist from India, Mr. Shiv Kumar, who's an IT professional and is a consulting editor for Indic Today. He regularly writes reviews of books that are of importance to Indian civilization. He is one of the authors of the anthology Unsung Valor, a collection of 10 lesser known Kurukshetra battle stories. He also regularly writes about Mahabharata and River Saraswati. A very warm welcome to all the panel members. And Mr. Harsh and Mr. Rajeev, take us through the book and give us a summary of your thoughts that went into the book.
Harsh, you want to go first? Should I?
Rajiv, you go first. You've summarized the book just today, so I think it's better if you go first today.
Okay. Thank you, Aparna ji, first of all, for inviting us to present our book and speak to the esteemed sort of scholars and guests on the panel today. So I would say the key idea of our book, A New Idea of India, is in the subtitle of the book. And if you read the subtitle, there are essentially two propositions. So subtitle reads individual rights in a civilizational state. So our suggestion in the book is that individual rights matter in both society and economy. In society, this entails that the state and its organs must treat all the citizens as equal. And unfortunately, this has not been the case in India for a long time under the Nehruvian rubric. So what we experienced was that rights were ascribed to groups, and often religious identity became a marker for the rights that were available to a citizen. In the sphere of economy, individual rights entails that people should be free to trade, indulge in voluntary exchange, and make and sort of sell goods and services freely. So if we trace back the economic history of India, as is well known, India remained mired in poverty for decades after independence in 1947, because we had embraced a draconian socialist approach to economic policy, where the state interfered and intervened in practically all aspects of economic activity, from production via licensing to price controls, as well as access to capital. And cumulatively, these measures had a devastating effect on the economy and very severe and tenuous consequences for the Indian people. And only in the last 25 or 30 years has India really started breaking free from these shackles and moving towards a more sort of free market approach. And the results are there for all to see. So free enterprise has done wonders for India. So that those two components are about the individual rights part. The second key piece of the book is that India isn't just a post-colonial nation state, but it is a civilizational state. So the Indian nation was not invented or created in 1947, but it has been pre-existing since ancient times. As Aparna ji mentioned, it is one of the world's, or probably the world's, oldest continuing civilization. And the British Raj did not invent India. For that matter, the Indian freedom movement leaders did not create India. So independence was just another milestone and one more event in the very long multi-millennia history of our ancient civilization. Properly understood, India is a civilization that is democratically transforming into a nation through the agency of the state. And I'm sure Harsh will expound more on this when he speaks after me. So most crucially, embracing individual rights is perfectly in consonance with India's, if we can call it, the dharmic philosophical ethos. And there's a lot in there, so we'll unpack that later as we discuss. But that's the kind of high level idea that the book sort of espouses. And in terms of the sort of composition of the book, there are 5 chapters, with the first couple of chapters laying out this civilizational framework within which we believe India is best understood. And we make the case that Dharma is and should be the guiding lighthouse for Indian polity. In other words, the Dharmic way espouses the view Tat Tvam Asi, or you are that, suggesting that an individual should treat another the way they would want to be treated. So after the first two chapters, we move on to individual rights and how it applies to the society. And this chapter actually critiques how politics has been conducted in India in this domain and makes the case for why a break from the past is necessary for social harmony. Then the fourth chapter gets into the subject of the economy, and we delve at length into the criticality of liberal market policy, of freer markets, and so on, for India to not just eliminate poverty, but become prosperous, become a wealthy nation. Finally, the last chapter of the book goes into various aspects of governance as well as foreign policy. And we get into the weeds really on different subjects such as education, health, justice delivery, and several other areas concerning the role of a government. And we have sort of concrete recommendations and ideas in the book on how government should be refocused and restructured to better perform its proper role. That is defense, internal security, justice delivery, policing, contract enforcement, and so on. So, with that sort of overview, let me hand it to Harsh. And Harsh, I think you can delve into some of the civilizational aspects as well as the changing sort of socioeconomic dynamics in India today.
Thank you so much, Rajeev. Thank you, Aparna ji and Vivekananda International Center, Bangkok, for having us. Thank you to all the scholars and the esteemed members of the diaspora, as well as the honored guests from Thailand itself. It's an honor for us that you took out time to hear about the book. I think Rajeev has summarized the book and laid out the framework absolutely succinctly and beautifully. So I can perhaps deep dive into a couple of areas to kind of put more color on that. See, when we say a civilizational state, what do we mean? For example, the only other civilizational state that is talked about in the world right now is China, right? So China is basically also another civilization that is or claims to be 5,000 years old. One can say there was a big break with Maoism, but then actually, if you now study Xi Jinping's politics, there is actually a revival of certain forms of Buddhism and sister worship. Temples are coming back in China. So it's a fair claim that there is a civilization. The difference is in the case of China, the state has been quite old. I mean, depending on whether you go back to the Warring Three Kings period or you go to this dynasty or that dynasty, but there has been a culture of a state which kind of claims to be representing all of China, even though that all of China is probably more like coastal eastern mainland China today than large parts of Xinjiang, Tibet, or Inner Mongolia. But there is this continuing history of civilization being represented by the state. In India, it's different. In India, while we did have a brief unification during the Mauryan times, around 2,300 years ago, and then that was one of the kind of catalysts for the spreading of Buddhism, by the way, both to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, but most prominently through Central Asia to Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan. And the words like Zen Buddhism, Zen comes from Dhyan, and so on and so forth. And when we talk about Buddhism, actually, there was no isms that spread. It was dharma or dhamma that was being spread. And often Buddha, bodhisattvas would be kind of transferred with Sanskrit or often Indian gods in various localized forms. There wasn't a neat distinction, by the way we now, with a kind of a modern Abrahamic lens, retrospectively, somewhat anachronistically look at it. So in India, what was different from China was that the society was the main element of continuity in India. Not necessarily because of something Indians chose, but for whatever reasons of geography, history, and polity, that Mauryans, maybe somewhat the Guptas and Palas in northern India in early medieval times, then to some extent the Delhi Sultans and the Mughals, and we can discuss the ideological basis of their rule, whether it was in consonance with Indian civilization or not, and then finally the British, because by that time human technology had advanced so much that you could have railroads and communications. It was possible to put together a subcontinental empire, and that is what after partition became the modern state of India. So in Indian context, unlike the Chinese context, the state is relatively new. The civilization is ancient, which is common with China, but society was more dominant. So now what is happening with the state is that the state, which is now a modern democratic state and therefore is more politically stable than perhaps China, is slowly transforming and congealing this civilization. Like any civilization, India was internally diverse, and I'll come to defining civilization after this sentence. We are converting this ancient civilization through a modern democratic state into a more coherent nation. That does not mean a homogeneous nation. It means a coherent nation. Like I was talking to Aparna ji before the podcast today, and she was saying that she's from Bangalore. I might be from North India, Rajiv might be from Rajasthan, but we are growing up in Calcutta. We can easily go to Bangalore or Hyderabad in Chennai or Pune and plug and play, right? That was not necessarily the case even 50 or 70 years ago. In fact, one of the first all India elites was the Indian civil services and then Indian administrative services. What we now take for granted of this pan-Indian mobility was true, but only for the elites. And this kind of intermixing in India, it could be from traveling, it could be from interdining, it could be intermarriage, it could be doing professions, taking jobs that your fathers or forefathers had not taken. It could be the financial independence of women. It could be the liberation of the so-called lower caste. This churn is happening simultaneously because of new economic prosperity. And the way Rajiv and I write in the book is this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more economic churn and growth happens, the more stimulus and catalyst there is a social churn. This, along with a united state and a pre-existing civilization, is now making us into a nation. So because India actually, India's character is much more akin to Europe actually, more than America or China in some ways. But the difference is in Europe, the intra-Christian sectarian rivalry led to the creation of the modern nation state, right? The Peace of Westphalia of 1648 was a result of the 30-year war between Catholic and Protestant factions. In India, we never had those sectarian wars, at least within Dharmic sampradayas. So we never kind of had the competitive intensity to create localized states. But now that we do have this United Nations state, we are basically going somewhere between the European Union and the United States. We are not as plug and play as the United States is, but we are even more united than the European Union is. And this is why it's a civilizational state, because an Andhra could be compared to a Poland, a Gujarat could be compared to a France, right? So what we consider as regions of states in India are actually countries, which is why in the European discourse, the word nationalism becomes bad. Also their experience of the two world wars. Whereas in India, we are not thinking of nations as Bengal or Gujarat. That we call sub-nationalism actually these days. So because of different vocabulary, we end up talking past each other. Now, what is civilization? Very briefly, I think this is an important point, and then we can, the other parts we can talk about later, but I think this is very important. See, if you can talk of civilization as capital C civilization, human civilization. The way V.S. Naipaul said, like an emerging universal human civilization. Or you can talk about civilization, small c civilization, as to be civilized. And you could have subjective opinions about civilized and barbarian. Or you could talk about civilizations in a more, I would say, classical way, or the way perhaps even Samuel Huntington uses, perhaps controversially, is there are different civilizations in the world. In that context, in that sense of definition, what is civilization? Civilization is the largest group of humanity, short of all of humanity itself, that has some internal coherence. I'll again repeat, it's the largest subset of humanity, so obviously short of all of humanity itself, which has some internal coherence. So when people, we all use and read the word the West, what does the West mean? The West, does it mean United States and Europe? But it also includes Australia, so it's not a geographical or Cartesian direction anymore. It's not a cartographic direction anymore. The West claims it's not a religious or racial dimension anymore. So what is that West? So it might be somewhat difficult to define or pin down, but there is something real which we perceive when we talk about the West. Similarly about India, you could talk about Indian civilization in an expansive sense, in a subjective sense, and people can disagree. For example, I would say, Rajiv, when I've written that Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, obviously in the larger rubric of Indian civilization, without any revanchist ambitions about somehow getting their countries to merge with India, not at all, but they belong to Indian civilization. In a broader sense, all of Southeast Asia was once called Indochina, right? I mean, there are deep cultural and civilizational linkages between Thailand and India. So if there are elements of Indian civilization in Thailand as well, there is a Cynic influence as well, and obviously the local indigenous influence is most important. So I think that in that civilizational sense, which was always politically divided more or less for thousands of years, that has now become a modern state, a democratic state, and that is what is very exciting about our times. Because what could that mean for economic growth? Because if India has remotely the same per capita income as any Western country, by definition, it will be the largest economy in the world within 10, because anyways, it is becoming the largest population of the world in 5-6 years. So what happens in India is extremely important in terms of culture, economics, foreign policy for the rest of the world as well, not just for Indians. So I'll just pause there. I hope that was a good kind of deep dive and color on civilization per se, after the excellent summary that Rajiv gave about the entire book. I just wanted to kind of focus on that word a bit more, because individual rights everybody knows in politics, but civilization is a somewhat new subjective term. Thank you. I think what we can do, Rajiv, if you don't mind, let me just quickly add a bit on the economics, then you add a bit on whatever you want to add, and then we can take questions. Because I think we kind of went a bit too deep on the social side, so I want to add on the economic side.
Yes, that would be good.
So I
Sure.
think the analogy that Rajiv very beautifully laid out, that individual rights in a civilizational state applies both to society and politics, but also to economics. Now, what does that mean? That means that as a general rule, as the default setting, people should be allowed to do commerce amongst each other, which, kind of very Adam Smithian kind of concept, which in any kind of modern state should be unexceptionable, not something to be remarked about, became very difficult to do in India, as Rajiv very eloquently summarized, especially in the 1970s. And I'm sure people like Sulabh would be excellent to add on to that. Anybody who has had any kind of family business the last 30, 40 years can give you, interesting or horrifying anecdotes, the way you look at it. But there is a caveat. So that individual rights about economic freedom or free markets is true. But the state part is also true, the civilizational state. Why that is important in this case is, for example, size matters in international economics. So like a Singapore, for example, or a Hong Kong, well, Hong Kong things might be changing now. Singapore or a Dubai has to be a free port, right? The way the Hanseatic League was in northern Germany. They have to be free port because they're so small that if they do not do this kind of specialization and exchange, there is no reason for anybody to do commerce or finance there. India, on the other hand, like China and like America to some extent, is large enough to be able to have some industrial or trade policy without compromising on free markets fully. So what I mean by that is, as a general rule, free markets should be there. But say, for example, somebody, because of America-China trade tensions, somebody wants to leave mainland China and do some manufacturing. Right now, the most obvious and easy thing to do is go to Vietnam, for example. Maybe Bangladesh has some attraction in textiles for various duties, kind of treaties they have with EU and etc. And the reason that happens is because of maybe there is an India-ASEAN trade treaty, which is good in cultural, geopolitical sense. In economic sense, it always has to be renegotiated. They go to Vietnam, but they will come to India, and increasingly they are also coming to India. If you say that we will never discriminate against foreign companies, but if you make in India, even if you're a foreign company, but if you make in India, you will not have to pay a 5 or 10 or 15% import duty. Therefore, there is a small wall that you have to jump over for imports. But even as a foreigner, which was not the case earlier. Earlier, they tried to do this kind of protectionism, but they were anti-foreign companies as well. What we are now doing in India, which I think is very important to appreciate the nuance, which is why Indian manufacturing exports is likely to do well in the coming decade, is you could be a Maruti Suzuki, which is a Japanese company. You could be Hyundai, which is a South Korean company. You could be a Thai or a Vietnamese company, or a Chinese company for that matter, in a non-sensitive sector. But so long as you manufacture in India, you are getting the same privileges as any Indian company. The only thing is that manufacturing has to happen in India, or that services exports have to happen outside out from India. And I think that is the nuance of exploiting India's size. That is the only thing. I'll hand it over to Rajeev for on the state capacity side, which I think is something that the Narendra Modi government has building on other governments doing very, very well. Rajeev, can you speak on that and any other issue?
Yeah, so building off of what Harsh sort of said about the economy and everything that India is trying to do in that area, let's come to the topic of a slightly broader topic of governance. So the way I would put it is there was for a long time in India a confusion of roles. So essentially, the government is trying to run businesses. The businesses are trying to get involved in electoral politics through all kinds of means, trying to influence parties or do kind of influencing through money and other means. And finally, even the judiciary was getting into the executive function. So no entity or no branch or no section of society is performing its actual role, and everyone is doing the other person's job, which is why I think for a good 4-5 decades, India was in a real mess. And now we sort of started disentangling that, where we are trying to say that let the government, let the executive, do the executive's job, policy making, and make the right policies that are good not just for some section of industry or some particular business house, but generally good for citizens and consumers. And then businesses are being held accountable, where they are being told that focus on running your business, abide by the law, pay back your debts, and don't do any funny stuff. Run your ship in a clean way. And the judiciary too, there's a lot of debate on this in India at the moment on the role of the judiciary, because we still often find that there are certain types of court cases and court judgments that emerge that seem to impinge upon what the executive should be doing. But there too, I think a healthy debate is going on, and I'm sure it will land in the right place in the coming years. But essentially, every arm of government, the key society factions and groups playing the appropriate role in the country, that is, I think, happening now and needs to happen for India to succeed economically, and the kind of changes that we need, especially in the area of government. In my earlier remarks, I had mentioned that the proper role of government is essentially to provide defense, to maintain internal security, to enforce contracts, to ensure justice delivery. So these are like 4 or 5, really important areas that are the proper role of government. And the kind of administrative governance reforms that we need for India to strengthen itself in that area. Some of them that we could highlight in the area of defense, for example, that we are seeing now in India, is the creation of the Chief of Defense Staff post, where finally India is kind of creating a unified sort of theaterization of its forces, and sort of setting leadership under a CDS, which is frankly, for many decades now, all the great powers in the world have had a CDS. So strengthening our borders, sort of standing up for the country's sort of rights, whether it's in the area of Ladakh or whether it's in other areas in the Western Front, or for that matter in the Northeast. So whether it's defense, we are seeing that when it comes to internal security, India has very successfully negotiated certain settlements with insurgent groups in some of the northeastern states. India has successfully kind of vanquished, I would say, the Maoist insurgency that was underway and plaguing the whole country 15 years ago. The Prime Minister at that time had said that it is the greatest threat before India. And I think 15 years later now, it is hardly in the headlines anymore. Whether it's the Maoist terror attacks that used to happen, or other kinds of disruptions which the Maoists created. So on internal security as well, I think India is a much more safer place, a much more secure place than it was even a decade ago. And justice delivery, like I said, it's a work in progress. Policing too, work in progress. But frankly, these governance reforms are necessary for India to realize its economic potential. So when you mix things up, when the government starts doing things such as running a fertilizer factory or building a steel plant or running hotels, then it gets distracted from these core functions, and it drives out the private sector from those industries. So those industries are best left to the private sector, to private entrepreneurs, and the government is best served by focusing on the core tasks of what a government should actually be doing, which I outlined. And finally, in closing, I would say that getting sort of the economic piece right is critical to success in both social policy, social harmony, as well as foreign policy. Because an economically weak country, or a kind of underperforming country, will never be able to sort of create the jobs necessary for the population, will never be able to meet the aspirations of the people. And if those don't happen, there will be social disharmony somewhere. I'm not suggesting that growth alone would sort of address all those problems, but growth, I think, is a big part of it. And even in the area of foreign policy, if you look at India's share of merchandise trade as a percent of GDP, I think for the longest time, even until the early 1990s, India lagged behind its adversarial neighbors like Pakistan and China, with whom we have fought wars. So essentially, when your trade is low, then you have lesser sort of negotiating levers with foreign influence, foreign powers, and kind of lesser international influence. So trade also, I think, should be seen as a lever for foreign policy, which for a long time most people in India did not connect. And kind of attracting foreign investment, Indian companies going abroad, Indian companies exporting goods, all of that is sort of crucial for sort of foreign policy. And I think only recently India has kind of started making this connection, maybe in the last 8 to 10 years, where we are actually putting this front and center, and going out to countries and sort of convincing them that you should invest here, you should do business with India. Likewise, Indian corporates are being encouraged to sort of globalize. So that kind of synthesis, between the economy and sort of foreign policy would go a long way towards sort of giving India its due on the world stage. And both of us believe that India should get its due on the world stage, because by its sheer size, as home to a sixth of humanity, why shouldn't India have a say in world affairs? So in summary, I would say getting the economy right, is frankly probably the linchpin for the bigger project of foreign policy as well as social harmony, and of course turning India into a prosperous country.
Aparna ji, I'll just add one thing with your kind permission. So what Rajeev was saying absolutely just reminded me one part that we could have also added is, the political economy of India historically was a patronage-based system, right? So this is where the politics, society, and economics all kind of meet and merge, and in turn affect the growth rate and potential of the country. So, for example, if you had any welfare program, there were 2-3 key aspects of that. A, it was overwhelmingly denominated by identity. That will still remain the case for some time, but it is increasingly, there is on the margin, there is less focus on that, and there is more focus on the economic capacity of the individual, poverty, etc. That's one. Secondly, the delivery mechanism was very corrupt, in the sense that if you were given 100 rupees, let's say, for working in the field for NREGA program, which is a job works program, you would go to the local post office and they would give you 60 rupees, for example. They would just take 40 rupees as corruption, as bribe. Now, what is happening is A, the identity part is becoming slightly less important, and B, technology is making delivery of any and every kind of welfare benefits, cash, conditional cash transfers much more efficient, much more mobile. For example, the ration cards right now be linked to the universal, the unique identity every Indian has, which will in turn allow them to get that subsidized food across the country and not just in their district or village or home or city or urban area or slum or whatever it is, which in turn allows them mobility to go and work somewhere else, and include, especially in these pandemic times when they have to do a lot of to and fro. So these kind of small things are basically making the individual Indian free in a substantive sense. And in turn, the savings and the higher growth is leading to more revenue, which goes into investing of infrastructure, physical infrastructure for logistics, for trade, for growth, for prosperity, or social infrastructure for education, the best long-term investment, or health, as we are seeing right now. So I think the transformation of that kind of top-down, patrimonial, feudal, privilege, and patronage-based society and state to not exactly, it's not Singapore or Sweden or Scandinavia yet, but it is much more efficient. And in many ways, I think Rajiv and I would agree, and anybody who lives in India, I've lived in Singapore, Hong Kong, US, UK. In transferring money within India is the easiest compared to all of these places. Small things in the startup ecosystem have made living in India for even lower middle class people very simple in many ways. And that's all. Some good governance, I would say 30-40%, a lot of it is technology. And that in turn is leading to this mobility, because if you're not fixed to that place that you were born, then that churning that happens, that makes for a much more powerful economy and nation. So I'll just hand over to you there.
Very interesting points. And just to summarize in a nutshell, that you're talking about minimum government and maximum governance in a way, and you're talking about transformation through technology. The Digital India program has revolutionized the entire social, does kind of dissolve so many social barriers, so to speak. So probably we can start a discussion with the panelists. Dr. Shiv, since you wanted to leave early, do you want to talk first? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this discussion. And I appreciate our young writers. And just, I think that Mr. Hirsch, he mentioned about Make in India. So actually, Make in India, the project aimed to changing the characteristics of India. But if I quote your words, like the others' words, I think you mentioned that the project is ambitious, but the ideation is flawed. Why did you feel like that?
Thank you so much, Dr. Subbu, for the question. I'm not sure I fully understood it, but if you're saying that the idea is good, but the execution is weak, if on that point, I'll simply say, I think I'm not sure if the execution is weak, in so much that I think expectations are very high, but I actually remain very optimistic about the project for various reasons, and I'm sure so does Rajiv, because of various reasons that have come together. The last 5-7 years, even earlier, but especially last 5-7 years, the government has focused a lot on infrastructure. And one of the biggest problems Indian manufacturers had was logistics cost. So that is falling, and actually next year it will fall dramatically. We have the dedicated freight corridor coming in. If you see a map of India, unlike China, which is all the populated areas are in the coastal area, in India, all the populated areas are along rivers in the northern plain, the really dense parts. And they historically were connected to the coastal regions via the rivers. The rivers were navigable. But what happened is, because we created irrigation canals, the water flow reduced, and the rivers which functioned as highways stopped functioning as highways, and then we forgot to build new highways. So now we are actually creating a very good railroad infrastructure program, and that is one. Number two, the trade and industrial policy and slightly better governance. It improves every year. I'm not saying things are perfect. The third factor is this pandemic has created a geopolitical reason for all exporters and manufacturers. In the industry jargon, they call it China plus one tactic. So, basically they're saying if I am an American Walmart supplier in America and I'm buying in bulk from China, then I'm not going to stop buying from China overnight. In the short term, I might even buy more because of the way all these deficits are increasing. But I want another manufacturer to diversify my supply chain. So it's not just in time, it is also the reliability of the supply chain. The just in time concept of Japan has been slightly modified because of these geopolitical realities. And very few other countries can take manufacturing at that scale. So Make in India is a combination of that infrastructure, that trade industrial policies, that geopolitical events. And I think it is actually doing very well. The corporate tax has been cut. For the last 5 months, we are seeing record exports. Just right now, the July numbers came out. Merchandise exports of $35 billion. It is 50% higher than last year, but even compared to 2019, it is substantially higher. So I think basically Make in India is working. And I think it is very important not to confuse it with the 1970s license Raj. Because right now we are open to all foreign companies. It's just about where you manufacture, not who manufactures. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and I would just add one point on that. So if you look at the exports that are happening in just two sectors, in defense production, as well as mobile phones. So if you look at the trajectory, so in terms of value and volume, I think because the starting point was very tiny or non-existent, we still don't sort of see that size impact yet. But if you look at the trajectory in the last 5 years, I think where we will be in the next 3-4 years, the answer will be clear.
Thank you.
Dr. Pianat?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join this wonderful event. To be honest, before reading the entire book, first I Google it first and see how the other people think about the book, and it's quite interesting when I follow and reading it. And when coming to read the book title itself stopped me to think, and it came to my mind that what is the new idea? Whose new idea? And it is the new idea that the author projecting really new idea. And after reading the book, what surprised me a lot seemed like our generation start criticizing the way we look at India, that based on secularism, non-alignment, and socialism underpinned by Nehru and Congress legacy. And this also the way I teach my students in Thailand right now about India politics and the massive development, but it's not concrete as the book described, but I'm sure we are on the same boat. However, the new idea that you propose seems to be the India that people from Asian countries, from Thailand, Thai people, we already perceive India as a civilizational state. Then my question is that you think the way you narrate or explain the book to Indian or the Westerner, will it be different to the way that you tell the Asian audience? And if your audience now is a Thai, will use the same story, and which part of the book you recommend a Thai to read the most? And the second, can I give another question? And if the idea of India is socially constructed in a particular period of time, in a particular period of place and society, yes, the idea that you propose today is the idea at the present day socially construct that might be challenged by the future idea. My another question is that could you predict the future idea of India as India become a great power? Do you think any change and how the upcoming government frame the idea of India? Thank you.
So, Dr. Professor, that's an excellent set of two questions. I think you're absolutely right that actually in places like Thailand and Indonesia, it would seem almost obvious that India is being called a civilizational state. And what Rajeev and I are in a way gently concerned about in the book is that this again, obvious proposition to both Rajiv and I, just like it is to you, is no longer considered obvious in India. And if you do say it so, it is perceived to be sectarian in nature, to be agenda-driven, quote-unquote communalism, which is a very Indian English word. It does not really have purchase outside of India. And what is interesting is, see, India is at the center of the old world. What I mean by that is the known old world. Of course, there was beautiful civilizations in the Americas as well. But if you look at Africa, Europe, and what we now call Asia and Oceania, India is literally at the center. So India has always had influences from all sides. And part of our elite, especially after the British colonial encounter, the elite especially lives physically in India, but mentally lives in the West. So what I mean by that is that because in the West, anything which is a non-liberal universalist identity would be seen as suspect. Therefore, to say that in India there is a civilizational, dharmic, or may I dare say the word Hindu in a broad sense, is seen immediately as something potentially controversial. Even though we are right now speaking at a Vivekananda International Center, for example, right? So to answer your question, it is more about the self-perception which has changed for elite Indians, not masses of Indians, in the last 30, 40 years, which is why we are kind of explaining the way we are. And the second point that you are asking is about, see, Rajiv and I were very clear that we will label the book A New Idea of India. We will not call it The New Idea of India, because we wanted to be epistemologically humble. Because, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we are two relatively young MBAs. Like, why should we get to define the idea of India, right? I mean, there are people who have written the book The Idea of India, and you know, I salute them, but we do not have that kind of self-confidence. So maybe the idea will be refined. However, I must say that there is an underlying thread which connects all these ideas, which does not dramatically change. And the final point I'll say to the answer of your question that Rajiv and I write in the book is that even Nehru, you know, Nehruvianism is different from Nehru. Nehru very much believed in a way, at least at the abstract level, in our idea of India, individual rights. He did not actually follow up, but abstractly speaking, he did. And he saw India very much as a civilizational state. So did Gandhi, so did Ambedkar actually, so did Sardar Patel. It is actually the middle 70s and 80s when India literally, by the way, coincidentally was the poorest economically in relation to the West and the rest of the world, which kind of shows that subconsciously, when we're economically very down, we do tend to fit in, and we find it very difficult to be assertive, even in a benign manner. So I think that kind of hints at the answer that you're looking for. Rajiv, do you want to add something?
No, just on the second question, thank you for that very thoughtful sort of thoughtfully put question there. So I would just say, you know, what will India bring if and when, you know, it becomes that kind of global superpower and so on. So and I know this is something very dear to Harsh also, this subject. So both of us, I think I can speak for Harsh also, both of us believe that India will bring a new universalism to the world. And it will not be a homogenizing universalism. So, you know, in India, you know, there is a saying, कोस पे बदले पानी, चार कोस पे बदले वाणी. What that means is, you know, every few kilometers, the water changes, and every dozen kilometers, the language changes. So when you are moving around in India itself, you encounter all kinds of diversity, linguistic, cultural, you know, gastronomic, of every kind. You know, there is, I'm sure if you have visited India, you've experienced it. So what that means is, you know, a globalizing India, an India that sort of becomes, let's say, among the world's 2 or 3 leading economies, will actually take culture with it outside. And it will not be a homogenizing force as, let's say, you know, the Christian West or, you know, the sort of erstwhile colonial British powers or colonial French powers, or, you know, even the American version of globalization, the way it has kind of had a homogenizing effect. I don't see India having that kind of a homogenizing sort of effect on the world. And it will be more of, you know, each person has their own way, and that is the way, if that makes any sense.
No, I mean, in fact, I would just simply say that in the book we write a line called Dharma is the original multiculturalism. So we say Dharma is the original small m multiculturalism. By that, what we mean is, and again, this is something that goes to both Vivekananda and Nehru. There is no ideological dispute in this. Anybody who studies India carefully, that India has always been about synthesis. India has always been about syncretism, right? There is and actually, if you look at all pagan cultures pre-Christianity, actually that is similar in Rome and Greece as well. Like you would see a Roman god being worshipped in Britain or Gaul in a different form, and you would see the merging of an Egyptian god with a Greek god and so on and so forth. So we did that in India very organically. Like there is a tribal, the Jagannath Puri Mandir in Odisha is a tribal deity, but we will kind of match it with a so-called non-tribal god. We'll say this is another version of it, or this is a family member of that god, and that harmony which India brings. And this is not in social culture. Another point that Rajiv and I often say is, see, because we're so comfortable with diversity, Indian businesses are naturally likely to do better as well. Because see, we don't need a department for diversity. We don't need an officer for diversity in India, because in India it is almost the moment you are born, you are always surrounded by diversity. It's very difficult not to be surrounded by diversity. So I think that actually has an implication not just on foreign policy, which will be profound, but also business as we go forward. Like Indian executives, one of the reasons I do think they do well in Silicon Valley right now, which is a sign of things to come in India itself, is because they're so naturally comfortable with diversity. So that's just my and Rajiv's hypothesis.
Dr. Shweta?
Yeah, thank you, Aparna. Thank you so much. Actually, let me first congratulate both of you, Harsh and Rajiv, for this wonderful.
Thank you very much.
After reading the book, I asked my daughter to read it as well. It very well depicts the journey of India. And I'll actually, while you guys were talking about this, I picked up a few words and I'll just try to link them together and put in some thoughts, some ideas here. Harsh was talking about prosperous and wealthy nation, India as a prosperous and a wealthy nation. And Rajiv was also talking about the roles applied, in different ways. And the third point I just had was the role of technology and the delivery mechanism. So I'll just try to link this together, especially when, the first thought that comes into mind is how we leverage our assets in New India. And of course, we all understand, we already spoke about the population as our natural advantage. After China, India, I think the third country is almost 1/4 of the population of India. So creating a service that would reach out to the masses would be a big success story in India. And purely from the business point of view, if I take your concept of New India and I try to represent it, as a product of, say, because it's New India, I just call it N and I, where N is the, could be the revenue stream coming from the new products and services, and I could be, the base starting from 0 to 1.3 billion people. And how do we address this? So the idea of maximizing I, that is the number of people reaching out to the masses, the first important thing, just keeping the revenue or, the product price low. And eventually, as technology being a main driver with policy regulations and, the kind of digital landscape we are talking about here, we could focus on increasing the value of N, and eventually, that would contribute to the economy, talking about the prosperous and the wealthy nation aspects. So if, again, the example, if I take from the telecom sector, which you have clearly mentioned in the book, I was quite curious and I just went back to check. The National Telecom Policy in 1994 had a tele-density of 0.8%, which is, and I recall in 1998, we could not think of, affording a mobile phone. It was quite expensive at that point of time. And telephone exchanges, they started and declared open in sometime in January 1882 in Calcutta, Mumbai, and Madras. And it took about 110 years for this teledensity to start increase from 0 to 0.8%. And then look at what happened in the next 30 years. That's pretty much because it's driven by the technology, the policy and regulation, the WTO commitment, and of course, you rightly highlight the NTP 1999. And here we are with, with the teledensity to 87.84%. So this is what has happened in 30 years. It's just bringing in the converging things, and it was just basically the right time where we could have all this together. But definitely telecom was a national issue, national subject. If we try to put that in terms of other sectors, agriculture, education, where again it's more like a state level issue and other things, then connecting to the second point, the roles which we talk about here, is it's very important to have that strategic intent, and that to be aligned from the top national level to the state level to the implementers, maybe at the final delivery point. And it has to be communicated clearly from top to bottom, just keeping it very simple, coherent, and a clear communication, which is very crucial. Every entity, I think, should have the feeling of ownership, the transfer of ownership, which again, touches on what Rajiv was talking about in terms of role. And the third issue, particularly when you talk about the delivery mechanisms, I can't, ignore talking about agriculture, which is very close to me again. And over the years, we have witnessed a lot of ups and downs, moving from food deficit to food surplus. We can look at, what the agricultural GDP was in 50s, about 51%. And as you rightly said, there was a lot of stagnation in between for a few decades. And lots of issues identified in the last decade, I would say. Like the new reforms coming into the agriculture sector recently, the Essential Commodity Act, the Trade Commerce Ordinance, and the national framework, again, connecting this. So these issues have actually proving beneficial. And I think in the last 17 years now, we see the agricultural GDP coming to about 19% after a very long period of time. The recent growth which has been seen here. And definitely we have a lot of technological experts here. So we see a lot of examples. I think when we talk about delivery mechanisms, you've the Jam Trinity in terms of, combining the banking, mobile, and national ID to basically automate the subsidy disbursement. So this technology is basically acting as a game changer for various sectors and various areas. And I think one of an important aspect today is if we want to talk about India in terms of accelerating the position of digital economy and other issues. So there needs to be some kind of interest, or maybe increasing in terms of investment in R&D or science and technology, which currently is just 0.7% of GDP. So that's a very important. Whereas you can look at countries like Israel, Germany, Japan, Korea. It's all 3-4% plus. Of course, Indian patents are quite low at this point of time, where now eventually we have started seeing Indian products coming in, which was not the case in the last decade. So I think this is very interesting in terms of the technological role, the technology role, and realizing the importance of this technology to scale up this benefit. And this brings me back to the point where I talk about New India, N into I concept, to reach out to the masses by making use of this technology and other aspects. So I think this is all I wanted to comment and share about connecting the points which you've raised. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
So, Dr. Shweta, thank you so much for your remarks. I would now like to move to Mr. Shiv Kumar. He's an author on Indic subjects, Indic topics. So I think he'll have a very different perspective on this. So please go ahead and. You're muted, Mr. Shiv Kumar.
Dhanyawad, Aparnaji, and Harsh and Rajeev, hearty congratulations. I read your book as soon as it arrived. And, one of the important things from your book is that it has surfaced a lot of things that, we were only discussing on the coffee tables and, small in-house discussions. So I think now we have a situation where we're talking about the civilizational state and the dharmic nature of the state, and so many related concepts that are of fundamental importance. And from that standpoint of time, congratulations again. I think in your book, one thing comes out very well. That is the philosophical inconsistency of the state, starting from 1947, until a few years back, I think comes out very strongly. No one thing was consistently applied, whether it was on religious matters or business matters, or nothing. And setting right that inconsistency is a key concern that you mention in the book, and it strikes. And of course, the question is whether the correction is happening with a philosophical clarity or not is actually the question that is in front of us. To be very specific, on the one hand, we have the individual rights. Now, of course, individual rights has gained currency because of industrial revolution 300 years back, because it is industrial revolution that created the biggest dynamic for movement of people. At the same time, all modern ideologies such as liberalism and so on and so forth. Now the question is that while visualizing a dharmic state, is the version of individual rights that we are conceptualizing our own? Is it within the dharmic framework? If that is so, what does that mean? Similarly, if the civilization is moving towards becoming a nation, which definitely it is, and there is no doubt about that, then the version of the nation that we have in mind, how different it is from the West. And if we have to speak of it in dharmic terms, what does that mean? Definitely, the imbalance in centralization and decentralization post 1947, we are setting it right. And of course, that has it is reflecting itself, especially on the economic front. But in the overall conceptualization of the nation as a civilizational nation, and the conceptualization of an individual right, are we visualizing our own? And how do we visualize that without bringing philosophy that exists and comparing those philosophies with the West? To be more specific, dharma is not operating in isolation. It is part of the Chaturvidha Purushartha. And if Chaturvidha Purushartha is a philosophical complex, then there is a beautiful interrelationship that has been conceptualized. And that is not without a relationship with, time, our sense of time, which is cyclical, which you very clearly mentioned in the book. And the cyclical sense of time is coming from a relationship between Srishti, Sthiti, Laya, where Srishti is always working for Sthiti in India, whereas in the modern industrial world, Srishti has an independent, dynamic, and Sthiti is trying to catch up with it. So I'm giving these two as simple examples. I think we've understood the fact that, the Industrial Revolution requires a higher degree of individual rights. We also understand that we ought to be a modern nation. And in our civilizational journey, that will be one milestone. And tomorrow, what will happen? That we will see 500 years later. But are these transformations happening on our terms and, with philosophical clarity that exists with us? So that is the, concern that I have.
So, Shiva Kumar ji, I'll, with Rajiv's permission, go first. It's an excellent question, and in a way, your question is at the root of all anxieties in political philosophy, cultural discussions in India. In a way, it is the main thing that we need to answer, and for that, of course, hundreds of more books could be written. This book is only a starting point. What I want to say is, just to paraphrase your question, are you saying if I get it right, is what we are doing, as you said, how much is it our terms, how much of it is our indigenous thought, how much are we basically copying the West and therefore then just putting a dharmic label on it shallowly? I think it's a very fair anxiety. But I think one must also put a couple of more axioms or more data points on the table. That first of all, the West itself is not static.
That's true.
The West itself has gone through enlightenment can only be seen as an anti-Christian revolution.
Correct.
Even though some people call it post-Christian or some people call it secularized version of Christianity, and there are some elements. For example, the modern day cancel culture is a secularized version of blasphemy and excommunication.
True.
But basically, the modern day West has gone through the refutation of monopoly on truth in one book, one tradition, one God, one prophet. And that is the result that we see. So the West itself is on a journey, and the West itself gets redefined because the West conveniently does not, for example, have Nazi Germany from the 1940s and so on and so forth. And it as I said, industrial revolution, as we industrialize, how much of it is we just being on that journey of humanity, and where somebody is just on a car in front of us, and therefore it is modernization but not westernization. It's very important to understand. If somebody is on the road ahead of you in a different car, are you both on a road, or are you copying that guy who's the car in front of you? No, you are actually following the road. They're two subtle different things: modernization and westernization. Now, in the case of dharma literally, the root word comes from that which holds, that which sustains. Exactly. So, it is in Hindu philosophy, you have a concept of Yuga Dharma and Sanatan Dharma. Sanatan Dharma is encompassing all times, all eras, all contexts. Although 100 years ago, it had a different connotation of orthodoxy, by the way. But Sanatan Dharma, the way we today understand it in a neo-Vedantic concept, or as Swami Vivekananda himself mentioned it, it had a what in Europe we call perennial philosophy. What we call in like Emerson or Thoreau's poems, we call perennial philosophy. Whereas, so there is Sanatan Dharma and there is Yuga Dharma. Yuga Dharma is specific. Sanatan Dharma can only be very, very lowest common denominator in general. So the individual rights, we are not saying duties are not important. Rajeev and I wrote individual rights as contradistinction to group rights. Duties are very important, but duties are in society. Rights are within the state context. So one thing that Rajeev and I try to make very clear in the book is state and society should always be kept separate.
Yeah, that comes out strongly.
At least analytically, even though the state is not a diu machina, it is from the society itself. but conceptually and analytically it has to be kept separate. So the rights are only within the political argumentation of the state, whereas duties, whether it is social, collective, or individual duties, are in the context of the society. So I think if you look at the way European Renaissance happened, European Enlightenment happened, the way they went back to Greek philosophy, the way they went back to pre-Christian Greek and Roman philosophy, and there was a deep influence of Indian Brahmins and Jains and Buddhists on that philosophy, including in Pyro and skepticism.
True.
So if we really do a deep analysis of this, we will find that there is a universal, deep, perennial understanding of the world, which cannot be neatly divided into Western and Indian. Just like today, it makes no sense to call 12304220 as a Hindu or Hindu-Arabic numerals. You know, you can say that without those numerals, nothing in the modern science and computer science would have happened.
True.
If we want a pat on the shoulder saying that, okay, there's something we contributed. So I think it's very important not to have that weightage on our shoulder. That, you know, authenticity is important, but contrived authenticity is something we have to be very wary of. So I'll just leave it at that. And Rajeev, do you want to like add something? But it's an excellent question, and we could literally discuss it forever. So.
No, so just in the, you know, literally in the opening pages of the book, we sort of hark back to the Nasadiya Sukta, right? So the whole emphasis on skepticism in Hindu philosophy, and you know, if you relate that to how Indian society has operated for so many millennia, even the kind of nature that the state took, although the state itself was, you know, in a way not really present in the way we would envision the modern state. So I think I would not view individual rights as a Western import or something. I in fact feel that, and that is the point that actually the first couple of chapters of the book make, that this kind of individualism is kind of tied closely to a dharmic worldview.
Yeah, I do not mean, definitely do not mean that individual rights is not something our own. My question was more in terms of, you know, is there do we view it differently, or, you know?
No, there can be differences. That's fine. I mean, you know, we need sort of copy, you know, whatever the West has formulated. But our point was simply to say that, you know, this is nothing new for us. Actually,
Absolutely.
we strayed away from that, and in fact, that was an error to stray away from that.
So I think one difference is that we are less missionary about it. So, for example, what happens is, you know, in the West, President Barack Obama early on, he said he is against gay marriage, for example. Now, what has happened is in the next 10 years, of course, the views of society in the West changed dramatically. And the Western mindset, in that sense, has that kind of proselytizing DNA somewhere deep inside, that if we change our mindset within 10 years, now everybody else in the world must change their mindset.
Yeah, that has crept into modern liberalism, actually.
Yes, so that is a difference whereby India is trying to say we are not against people changing for the better, but we are against active proselytizing in all fields, whether it's religion or political philosophy or political models for that matter. We want to show more by the example, the power for example. So it's not. What happens in the West is if they think this is the cutting edge of human rights today, 2021, everybody has to do it, even if they themselves did not do it in 2011, for example. So I think that kind of proselytizing fervor we still do not have. And while we should be more assertive, I hope we never have that kind of proselytizing fervor.
True.
Dr. Chaivat, before I request you to talk, can I request all the panelists to make the remarks and questions short so that you know, it can be answered better by the authors. Dr. Chaivat, please go ahead.
First of all, I'm so appreciated to be invited to discussion. As I'm a university lecturer and I teach in Rajabhat University in Surat Thani province, and I have many students. Very nice to meet both of you, and your book is very interesting for my students. No doubt, your book will be in my university library for my students to study.
Thank you, Dr.
And
Chan.
I'm interested in Indian civilization and also Indian politics. Especially, I teach Indian political thought as well. I have only question to make it short, because your books cover many interesting contents. And I ask you only one question because so many people already asked you, and you answer very proper answers. So only question that a new idea of India. This topic is quite interesting, and I'm interested in Indian social welfare and social security. So I would like to ask you about a new idea of India social welfare and social security. Only this question. Thank you very much.
Should I go, Rajeev? I'll go. So thank you so much, Professor, for that very specific and relevant question. Absolutely. I think, as you kind of, Rajiv and I hinted in our earlier remarks, so social security or social welfare or the welfare state, we are completely re-architecting that in India right now, partially thanks to technology that Shweta had also kind of commented upon. So what we have in India is, just to kind of spell it out for non-Indians, is we have something called the JAM Trinity. So it's JAM. So J stands for Jan Dhan, which is a bank account, like a low frills bank account, which now every Indian has, which was not the case till 5 or 10 years ago. A stands for Aadhaar, or a unique ID, like a social security number. M stands for mobile phone, which basically now all Indian adults have. And very soon all of them will also be smartphones, but at least you have a smartphone or a basic phone. For all, even the poorest Indians mostly have it. So what now has happened is it becomes very easy to directly send any kind of cash, and increasingly even benefits or coupons or vouchers, which can be used for only specific purposes. So one, the delivery part has improved. B, I think there's a much bigger recognition of the reality that the third part, I'll come to the third part, that as the modern economy becomes much more knowledge focused, technology digital focused, and therefore it also has more big winners and losers. You need to provide some kind of, I would not say equal opportunity, that's always never realistically possible, but much more equitable opportunities. And part of that is good education. So Rajiv and I write a lot about school choice, not letting private schools getting some funding from the government, not just government schools. Obviously, healthcare is very important right now, as we are seeing. So the idea is to do more of this and do more of this efficiently. And the third point that I would say, on social security is that there's a strong realization that social mobility in India is economic and social mobility in India are deeply interlinked. So we do have a caste-based affirmative action program in India. It is not perfect, but it is better than having nothing. It may not be forever conceptually, but until there is at least some sense of equity, we have it. So it's not just economic equalization. There is also an element of social equalization. And it does get, people have very deep views on this, but that is an element of social security. And I think finally, unlike the Western states, we are a much younger population. So I think our median age is 27 or 28. So right now our focus is much more on providing human capital to the younger people, as opposed to having very big pension and healthcare states. Although we also have to start making steps towards that. And Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, he has already launched a very incipient version of universal healthcare in India, which Rajiv and I write about in the book. So it's about more money, more efficiently spent, but also about social and economic mobility through technology. Rajiv?
No, I would just add to that coming back to the sort of issue of what is the role. So when a government essentially runs companies that a private sector can run, then it cannot perform activities such as social welfare or social security properly. Because the distraction and the kind of fiscal pressure that running a business entails takes away from that role that the government should perform. Obviously, the private sector cannot give a social security or should not be expected to give social security. And in a way, we muddled that up in India, where the government was running, let's say, telecom companies or telephone companies, steel plants, fertilizer plants, and then the entire load of social security was put on the private sector through different kinds of very draconian laws, on employment, on other kinds of benefits to be given, and so on. So I think disentangling the two things, where the private sector can run its business. Obviously, it should abide by the laws, pay their taxes, and so on and so forth, and let the government, with technology, start addressing the sections of society that need that particular welfare. And welfare should also be need based, is another point that we make in the book. So sort of crudely saying that we are going to give X to this group and Y to that group, that is no longer efficient and is not necessary. So group identities are in a way markers or crude markers of need in a way. And today we have the technology to be much more efficient about it in terms of delivery, where India has built this system of universal sort of identification linked to bank accounts, and sort of a welfare transfer system where the beneficiaries who are eligible get the money in their own accounts and they can use that money. So all of this together essentially means that, like Harsh said, we are re-architecting social welfare. And with the privatization policy announced last year, the government is also exiting those kind of industries and businesses where the private sector needs to take up the role. So I think, and in closing, I'll also add that, I mean, a lot of people say that if you're supporting free markets or liberal markets, how can you support welfare? Well, I don't see the two as a either or. In fact, in a democratic country, in a sort of a country with a lot of poor people, at something like 10 to 15% of India still remains quite poor, and that means 100 million people. So when we have poor people as fellow citizens, government should and will take care of those people to sort of empower them, to sort of bring them up to a better standard of living. The question is on how it should do that rather than whether it should do that, in our view.
Dr. Sulabh?
Yes, hi, good evening, and thank you again. Thank you for the great discussion here, and really enjoyed the book. You've touched upon a number of things in the book, and I think in this discussion we haven't really touched upon the social aspects. And but honestly, I think that's a very important, larger discussion. But you talk about the economy, and I want to stick to that a little bit. Look, no doubt, cannot agree more, right? That the economy, it's the economy, stupid, as an American president once very famously said, and that is the key. And then, frankly, if we look at China, which we often look at, I look back to my own childhood. In the 90s, India and China were on par. Any graph you put, it was India and China was about the same, and today it's the disparity is huge. And it's driven by the economy, right? Huge differences, cannot compare. But I want to, I guess, discuss one important thing, which is around our democracy. Without a doubt, I think Indian democracy is something for us to be extremely proud of. It's a very robust system. It's a secure system, despite what many naysayers might say. I think it's there, and it's going to stay, right? And also, I disagree with you often read it's an imported system. No, it's not, right? Democracy has been a part of India's social fabric for a long time. So, matter of great pride. I think it's it's allowing a lot of stability, and everything's great about it, but it's also a big double-edged sword, right? We take the economic liberalization of 91, which I think indisputably has, influenced, allowed India to get to where we are, the technology improvements, the infrastructure, everything we're talking about. 91 was a massive kick in the, in the rear for that, right? Sparked by external, extraneous factors, but hey, happened. Great. But even then, the discourse today, 30 years on, there isn't this in universal acceptance that that was absolutely the right thing. You'll still find apologists. You'll still find discussions that, oh, but we should go back. That's not the Indian way, etc., etc. Unfortunately, my question, I guess, therefore, is how do we ensure that this sort of crazy cycle of elections, the shackles of elections, do not always bring up these forces to pull India back in the other direction, right? And it's not just central elections, right, which happen every 4 or 5 years, 5 years, but it's really even these state elections, these municipal elections even start impacting policy, which I know the current Narendra Modi government, there was a discussion around having sort of set periods. Unfortunately, that didn't really go through. But I guess my simple question then is, democracy is a double-edged sword, and it's giving us the stability, it's giving us this individual rights, it's giving us a lot that we are proud of. But on the other hand, it's also gives opens it up to the forces which might either pull the reforms back or might distract from the key issues on hand.
No, so I would say, so it really comes down to the lived experience, right, of people. Now, let's take the example of Telecom, which is my favorite example, and we've written at length about it in the book. You only need to see some Hindi movies or other movies from India made in the 1970s or 80s to see how people are screaming into the phone, right? To make themselves heard. And obviously, STD calling or long distance calling is kind of a preserve of the rich. No one can sort of afford that apart from a very small clique of people. And here we are, in 2020, 21, where practically every single person in India has a phone. And not only are they talking to their loved ones wherever they work, they're also video conferencing with them on the latest handsets. So that is the lived experience of a person that has experienced, freedom in markets. Now, a voter may not be able to make that connection, but I think ultimately those leaders in politics, those who are in government, they have to go to people and make this case. That see what was there earlier and see what is there today. I mean, what happened in telecom, we are seeing on aviation. I was in Bombay some months ago, and my driver in Bombay, he was dropping me to the airport, and he asked me, what is the luggage allowance that is there in a flight? And I told him, and then I said, what makes you interested in that? So he said, I'm thinking of taking a flight back when I go this time to my town in Bihar from Maharashtra. And in fact, there are flights now. So that is how people are experiencing change, where there were 2 flights a week or 3 flights a week between Calcutta and Bombay run by a state-run carrier. And now there are flights all over India connecting small towns with big cities, small towns with small towns. And all sections of society, working class people, middle class people, upper class people, they take the same flight ultimately, right? I mean, obviously, maybe some people can afford a business class ticket or whatever, but for all practical purposes, your experience is the same. You go to the same airport, you sort of sit in the same aircraft, and that is a very beautiful sort of equalizing experience. You have to go through the same security check line, no matter who you are. So in that sense, the lived experience of those who are seeing the fruits of reforms, I don't think they want to go back. So some venal politician or small-minded, hucksters, I will call them that, hucksters only. I mean, they might try to play this up and, try to create sort of divisions that, oh, this one is rich and that one is poor. But ultimately, the lived experience of a citizen will shine through, and it's up to the leaders to emphasize to them that, this is what it was earlier. Now you have this. And do you want to go back to that? I think the answer is pretty clear for most people.
So I think, Sulabh, go ahead.
No. No, please go ahead, Harsh, please.
No, I was just adding to Rajiv's comments on your in response to your question. And as that controversial leader Winston Churchill said, right? I mean, democracy is the worst form of government.
The best we have.
but except that we don't have any. So it's the same. So I think some people call it the democracy tax. I see it as the democracy insurance premium. See, there is definitely a slowdown effect of mass democracy. You rightly made the point about the nitty-gritties that, maybe you could have less frequent elections that even the Prime Minister has requested. Maybe not every 5 years, but like something like the American system where they have the congressional elections every 2 years and the presidential election every 4 years. So this cycle is immense, but okay, at least for 1 year in the middle, 6 months here and there, you can get some governance done. Whereas in India, there is an important election every 3 or 4 months, right? So it is one of the lacuna of a system. Nonetheless, on a broader point, I think democracy really gives immense stability to India, especially to a diverse kind of civilizational state that we have. As an investor in China, you can always kind of ride the tiger. You never know what happens to the Communist Chinese fight. You just never know. I mean, Tiananmen Square was crushed. Maybe the next one is not, or it cannot be, or there is a Chinese Gorbachev. You don't know. The Indian system is not fundamentally being thrown out. There will be evolutions, but there will be no revolutions in India. And I think that is a huge positive in terms of investor confidence. Now, I agree with Rajeev that, like the lived experience of, we quote Andy Warhol in the book that, if everybody is having a Coca-Cola, I don't know, from Marilyn Monroe to the president of America to the bum on the street. So there is an element of, consumer capitalism.
That is the beauty of capitalism, actually. Everyone has the same cell phone service. Everyone has the same airline. Everyone flies Indigo or uses Airtel, whatever.
So, why don't you make a question and then I'll respond? Why don't you make the comment? I think you want to say something. Yeah.
No, so look, I guess, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I think the point I was making is it's not about taking back. I fully agree with you, Rajeev. Look, that is not happening, right? There will be a revolution if that happens. So I think, the lived experience, I agree. I think the question is more on, if the delta between where India was, let's say pre-91 and where it needs to be, we bridged a large part of it with 91 and then of course post-91 reforms. But there is still a delta. When it comes to ease of doing business, when it comes to where the economy needs to be, when it comes to raising those per capita incomes, GDP, etc. Right? I think what I'm contending is that the current cycle of elections makes that pace of covering that remaining gap a lot harder, right? And you have these little vested interests that are able to speak up, and though it may not be in the general good, of course, for that locality, that restriction on new manufacturers is good. So boom, that stays. It is as a small example, right? And I think the question in front of us, if you want to get to those per capita incomes that we all believe India is capable of, I'm wondering if another 91 type,
I see a question now, Sulabh. It's more about the future reforms you're saying than reversing any past reforms.
Yes.
I think on that I'll partially disagree. Of course, what he's saying is correct, that it makes it more difficult. There's no denying that. We saw recent protests against the farm laws, which have not been removed, but they've not been enacted. They're on the books, but they've not been fructified. So it's always like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Having said that, despite all the difficulties, the cumulative impact of all the reforms in the last 7 years is, in my view, not less than 1991 either. in the sense that you go to labor reforms, codes being merged, you have a massive revolution in the indirect tax, the GST, again, teething issues in the beginning, which shows that big bang reforms in India are not an event, they're a process. We have the bankruptcy code, which is chapter 13, 11, 7, equivalent of the US, whatever, which allows you to like have a continuing operation and then equity guys get wiped off. And therefore there is not a loss of actual productive capacity. We have very small things like much easier for work from home for BPOs, people we know who are doing these small reforms. We have massive reforms in the capital markets actually happening. Much more needs to happen, no doubt. And I think if you look at the continuous pace that's happening, despite the state level, regional kind of nuances, what we have seen in the last 7 years, if there is a majority government, if there is a clear national mandate, and I'm not talking about any one particular party to be very clear, if there is at least a progressive minded, simple majority, all parties can take some more risks, and which this government, to its credit, despite its various limitations, have taken those reforms. What we are not seeing yet is the impact of those reforms, which is very similar to, by the way, what happened in 98 to 2004, where cumulatively there were a lot of reforms, and Rajeev and I kind of write about in the book. But it took the macro cycle turning in around 2003, the dollar, the credit cycle, the global commodities boom cycle, for the cumulative impact of those built up reforms to show in the next 5 years. So we are likely to be surprised in the next 5 years. I mean, this is my investor hat speaking than an author or a political analyst hat speaking. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. See, even when we kind of break down the 1990 to 2020 China-India divergence, there are 2-3 aspects of it. One is the currency. So if you look at the real rates on the local currency versus in dollar terms, there's a difference. So that could converge, not getting into too much technical macroeconomics there. Secondly, there is a big demographic difference. China already has seen its demographic peak in the last 5 to 10 years. Both of these super cycles and demographic working age populations in China and India started in the 1970s. If you map out the 25 to 65 population as a percentage of the population, which can be considered peak working age, both kind of bottomed out in 1970s in India and China. China peaked out last decade. India will peak out in 2040s. So because India did not have this radical one-child policy, India's demographic boom is much more gradual, much more stable. So see, just like the democracy part, the demographics part is another stable mechanism in India. So what can diverge by 5x can also converge by 5x. It's just the same CAGR difference in the other direction. So whether it's truly an inflection point, whether it happens or not, people can have their own views and skepticisms. But I would say, while we have a lot to learn from Chinese single-mindedness, but at the end of the day, we cannot build expressways by throwing people out, right? We have to have basic environmental policies. We have to do land settlement. We have private property, even though it's not a fundamental right anymore. It is a real legal right. We need eminent domain-based proper compensation. We can argue on the quantum. So I think those things make, once India decides something, then the pace increases rapidly in India. So like our roads minister, Nitin Gadkari, we have a record of 40 kilometers per day of expressways being built. He just recently said he wants to go to 100 kilometers. It might not happen in this term. He may not be the minister. It might happen in 7 years, 5 years. But once that momentum, that snowball effect picks up in India in any sector, then it really goes for scale. So I would be a bit more sanguine, maybe by nature, less by empiricism. So I would say, let us see how the demographics, the currency, and the cumulative impact of the reforms plays out in India. Because India, as we go through a weak dollar phase the next 7-8 years, might see very rapidly, because we're already seeing early signs of that post-COVID in exports, the global markets. It's just that the second wave kind of took the data out of whack a bit. So I'm much more optimistic. In any case, we have no option of bunking democracy. Not that you meant that in any case.
Yeah.
And any electoral reforms have to happen by consensus, right? By a 2/3 constitutional amendment or something. So it is what it is. I think the only lesson for the Indian electorate is to give clear mandates. And if you see that, they're actually doing that, not just at the center, they're doing that even at state levels. So it's very clear, boss, you are the prime minister, you're the chief minister, please work for the next 5 years. And I think that model is working well. So that kind of coalition politics is less important right now, even though that in turn has issues with India's internal democracy, etc. So I think the illiterate is ये जनता सब जानती है, and especially the educational literacy of the average Indian voter is much higher than it was in the 1950s. So I think the collective wisdom is there. I would be more sanguine about the average voter, perhaps.
No, actually,
how it should be.
just to add to what Harsh said, I see this as more a leadership sort of question than a democracy question. So what I mean by that is, what can be challenged by, let's say, some special interest group can also be pushed back by a determined leader who can also offer the other side of the argument. I mean, that's the logic of democratic politics, right? So let's say if there is a special interest trying to stall something or torpedo something, and those who are supporting it can also point that out, that why are they doing this, and then the healthy debate happens. Then both sides put their views forward, and then we proceed logically.
But reform in India is always tough. Even the army reform that Rajeev mentioned, CDS creation, the Chief of Defence Staff. What we are doing is now we are creating regional theatre commands, and so now there's a classic turf war, like the army versus the navy versus the air force. Similarly, in the financial policy side, there's a turf war between the central bank and the SEBI, which is the Indian SEC. So those stuff, and by the way, that happens between ministries and bureaucrats all the time.
The world also, I would say.
I would say it happens across all democracies. I mean, I was just watching
all countries have that.
Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister on some OTT domain. So it is the nature of the beast.
Yeah, no, and actually the benefit, of course, is that in a democracy, because you allow that debate to happen. Once that reform does happen, the debates happen. The discussions of debate versus in a more authoritarian regime, the debates happen later, or you squash those debates, and then it erupts at some point.
And to be honest, I think the scope for doing reforms by stealth, in the present day sort of 24/7 social media environment, I don't think that's possible anymore. That in 1991, like a few guys decided, let's do this, and the 5 newspapers reported that. The way things are scrutinized nowadays in democracies, I think leaders have to own what they're doing, and frankly, that's what we've been seeing in India. I mean, government leaders, the Prime Minister himself, the kind of backing they have given to the private sector, to sort of the role of business, to entrepreneurship, to technology sort of leadership. All these things are getting backing from government actors in a way which, frankly, we've never seen in India in the last 50 years.
Thank you so much for those comments. I know it's getting quite late, so I'll hand it back to Aparna ji and probably wrap it up from there.
Does anyone else have any further questions? If you're okay, we can end this session. But before ending, I know very simplistic fashion, when you're talking about this reforms and the optimism that is there, I just want to highlight last week's in performance at the Olympics, and that we won 7 medals and the first athletic gold medal. And somebody pointed out that it's a gradual move from a collectivist society to an individualistic society, and that is kind of tied up with a more robust economy. That was the kind of comparison that they made. So I thought that was very interesting. Probably there is a shift going on very stealthily, and we should be more optimistic about reforms. It's been we have seen a lot of reforms, and we are seeing the fruits of it, like you were talking about the Jan Trinity and the Digital India. The transformation has been huge in a very short period of time. So I think we should be very optimistic about the future.
I just want to make a brief comment. I just want to say, so it is so complete honor for me and Rajeev to be able to speak at a center named after Swami Vivekanand, and in a country such as Thailand, which has very, very deep civilizational linkages with India. Of course, the king names himself in the fashion of Ram, and the kind of mythical capital is named Ayodhya. And I think these are things that are kind of civilization and very old. and sometimes transcend even religion. I mean, the Garuda symbol is there for in Indonesia. It's all this region does feel like home. So we are very blessed to be able to speak to an audience there. Thank you.
So to describe in a nutshell, the new idea of India that Mr. Harsh Gupta and Mr. Rajeev Mantri present is about India, the civilization transforming into a modern nation. It is about individual liberties that are bound by the collective. They discuss the political, social, and economic context in which such an idea is possible while stressing on the deeply democratic nature of the Indian civilization. Thank you for a very thought-provoking session and discussion, and I'm sure all our viewers will enjoy this session very much, the various ideas and the constructs that Mr. Harsh and Mr. Rajiv have put forward. I would like to thank Mr. Harsh and Mr. Rajiv once again. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I would also like to thank the eminent panel, Dr. Chaivat, Dr. Pianat, Dr. Shweta, Dr. Sulabh, Dr. Shibu, and Mr. Shivraman. Thank you so much. Swadika.
Thank you so much, everyone. Honored to be with all of you.
Thank you.